There's a question that every historian of the American Revolution has to answer, and most of them get it completely wrong. It's not about who won the biggest battles. It's not about tactics or terrain or the genius of Washington or British incompetence. The real question is this: why did an army of starving, barely trained civilians ever stand a chance against the most powerful military empire in the world? And the answer isn't what you've been taught. Most of us grew up hearing stories about the glorious revolution, about Minutemen who could fire in a minute's notice, about farmers turned soldiers who understood their land better than any redcoat. The mythology is clean, it's inspiring. It's also mostly a lie. The truth is far darker, far more complicated, and infinitely more human than the version we teach in schools. The real secret to how a ragtag militia force survived against overwhelming odds had nothing to do with tactical genius. It had everything to do with something we don't talk about anymore in military history, something that modern commanders have almost entirely forgotten how to do. It was called unit cohesion through shared hardship. But here's where the standard history breaks down. Nobody was celebrating it. Nobody was writing poems about it. In fact, the men who mastered this skill were often the ones erased from the record entirely. When we talk about the teenage blacksmith leading 30 starving militiamen against 200 British regulars without losing a single man, the narrative always focuses on the impossible victory, the bravery, the tactical miracle. But that story is actually hiding something much more important, something that changes everything about how we understand what it took to build an American fighting force from nothing. That blacksmith's real achievement wasn't the victory itself. It was something he did before the battle. Something he did in the weeks and months leading up to that moment that nobody talks about. The battle was just the proof of what he'd already built. What he'd already created was a unit where men would choose to die for each other rather than run. And that is a skill that is learned, that is built not through rousing speeches or impressive credentials, but through the deliberate, exhausting, often invisible work of keeping broken men bound together through impossible circumstances. This is the story that military historians have been missing. Not because the records don't exist, they do, but because we've been asking the wrong questions about what these men were actually accomplishing. We've been looking at the battle outcomes and assuming the leadership was about fighting, when the real leadership was about keeping them human, when everything was designed to reduce them to numbers. Here's what they never tell you about British regulars in the Revolutionary War. Most of them were good soldiers. Many were veterans. They had supply lines, uniforms, decent rations, actual barracks, and officers who had studied military science at the finest academies in Europe. They had every conceivable advantage. And yet when they faced a militia unit that had been led by someone who understood something they didn't, something that transcended pure military training, they could be stopped. Bloodied, sometimes broken. The British commanders were eventually forced to write reports back to London complaining about a kind of enemy they weren't trained to fight. Not because of American ingenuity and tactics, but because of American unity in suffering. They were reporting on something that violated their entire understanding of how soldiers functioned. These American militiamen would refuse to break under conditions that would have shattered European armies. Not because they were braver, but because the bonds between them had been forged in something stronger than fear. And the men who built those bonds, the captains, the sergeants, the few officers who understood that their real job wasn't to bark orders but to hold men together, those men almost never made it into the official histories. They were too busy keeping their units alive to write detailed journals about their methods. They were too focused on the next day's survival to document the subtle, unglamorous work of leadership under starvation conditions. So their names were forgotten, their techniques were lost, and every generation since has had to relearn the same brutal lessons from scratch. Let me take you back to the specific moment that proves this. It's not the battle, it's the week before the battle. It's the decision that nobody talks about, Yule Duar. The teenager who led this militia company had been given an order. The order was to hold a position that everyone, and I mean what everyone, believed was indefensible. The men under his command were sick, starving, and had been pushed to the absolute edge of what human beings can endure and still function. He had two choices. First choice, follow the order, position his men where he'd been instructed, and watch them get surrounded and slaughtered. This would be the honorable choice, the proper choice, the choice that would be celebrated in official reports, held position against overwhelming odds, even if none of his men survived it. Second choice, do something that his superiors specifically told him not to do. He chose the second path. He moved his men to a position they were supposed to avoid. A position that made no sense on any official map. a position that his officers had specifically marked as tactically unsound. He did this based on one thing and one thing only: his intimate knowledge of the men under his command. He understood that his men couldn't survive in a standard defensive position, not because they lacked courage, but because they didn't have the physical stamina, they didn't have the supplies, they didn't have the rest. What they did have was a kind of knowledge that came from living together through suffering. He understood that they functioned better, fought better, held better, refused to break better, when they were on terrain that felt familiar to them, when they had slightly better shelter, when the position gave them even a tiny psychological edge. In other words, he understood his men as humans, not as tactical units. This is such a simple thing to say that it sounds absurd. Of course a commander should understand his men. Of course you should know who you're leading. But here's the problem. At that level of military organization, across the span of the Revolutionary War, most commanders didn't. The British officers came from a system where social distance was mandatory. You didn't eat what your men ate, you didn't sleep where they slept, you maintained rank through separation and ceremony and the threat of the lash. It was efficient, it was proper, and it created armies where soldiers followed orders because they had no choice, because disobedience meant execution. But it created something else too. It created soldiers who would abandon a position the moment they thought they could survive by doing so. Soldiers who didn't believe in their officers enough to die for them. The American militia system, at least the ones that survived and became effective, operated on a completely different principle. The captain who led without the distance, who understood that his legitimacy came not from his rank, but from his willingness to share the same hardship as the men around him. That captain could ask men to do things that should have been impossible, because they trusted him in a way that transcended military obedience. This is what the British reports were really documenting, when they complained about an enemy they couldn't understand. They were documenting the existence of units that were bound together by something deeper than military discipline. Units where a command to hold a position was obeyed not because of fear of execution, but because the men understood that their captain would die before abandoning them. This creates a completely different kind of soldier. It creates a soldier who might be hungry, might be sick, might be terrified, but who will hold, who will stay, who will refuse to break, because breaking means letting down the man next to him, the man who shared his last piece of bread, the man who sat with him through fever. And this is where we get to the moment that changes everything. The teenager, because that's what he was, barely old enough to have a beard, made a decision the night before the battle that should have gotten him court-martialed. He knew his men couldn't win a direct confrontation. 200 trained British regulars against 30 half-starving militiamen? The mathematics was clear, but he also knew something that his superiors didn't. He knew that his men would hold if they believed in him. And he knew that believing in him required a different kind of proof than what officers usually provided. So he did something extraordinary. He told them the truth. He gathered them around, and he said, plainly and honestly, that they were going into battle against an enemy that had every advantage. He said that the odds were terrible. He said that some of them might not come home. And then he said something else. He said, I'm going to be in the front, and I'm going to be the last to leave. If you fall, you do it knowing that I fell first, or I'm standing in your blood after you're gone. This is not the kind of thing that shows up in official military histories. It's not strategic. It's not sophisticated. In fact, it's deeply against the rules of formal warfare. But it worked. Because in that moment, every single man around that fire understood something fundamental. This officer wasn't sending them anywhere he wasn't willing to go. He wasn't asking them to make a sacrifice he wouldn't make himself. And that changed everything. The next morning, when the British attacked, those 30 men held their ground against 200 trained regulars. They held it not because of genius tactics. They held it because breaking the line meant that their captain would have to stand there alone, and that was not going to happen on any of their watches. When the dust cleared, not one of them was dead. Not the captain, not a single man. The British withdrew. The report back to command was stunned. How had this happened? How had an impossible position held? The official explanation was about terrain and luck and perhaps some flaw in the British approach. The truth was something no formal military analysis could capture. These men held because they loved their captain more than they feared death. And that is not something you can teach in a textbook. You can't learn it from a manual. You can't implement it through regulation. You can only build day by day, through shared hunger, through showing up in the rain with your men instead of staying dry in a tent. through listening to their fears instead of dismissing them, through eating the same terrible rations and sleeping in the same cold, through being present in a way that most officers were never trained to be. This is the story that got lost in the revolution's official history. Because the men who mastered this kind of leadership, this humble, almost invisible work of holding human beings together through impossible circumstances, they rarely made it to the ranks where their names would be recorded for posterity. They died in obscurity. They were promoted into positions where they had no direct contact with men anymore. They simply disappeared from the narrative because nobody was writing down what they actually did. But their impact is visible everywhere if you know where to look. Look at the militia units that held their ground. Look at the formations that refused to break. Look at the places where dramatically outnumbered Americans stood and fought with a cohesion that shocked the British command. Every single one of those moments was built by a leader. Often a young one, often someone with no formal military training, often someone who simply understood that keeping men human was the real job of leadership. Not inspiring speeches, not brilliant tactics, not impressive uniforms or the authority of rank. Just the simple, exhausting, unglamorous work of showing your men that you would bleed for them before you'd ever ask them to bleed for you. The teenage blacksmith who led those 30 men wasn't famous in his lifetime. He wasn't promoted based on that one battle. He wasn't celebrated by the Continental Congress or given command of larger forces. He stayed in the field. He stayed with his men. He did the same invisible work over and over again for men he'd never met before and would never meet again, building units that could withstand impossible pressure. And in doing so, he contributed to something far larger than any single battle. He contributed to the building of an American military tradition that was fundamentally different from the European models that had come before. A tradition where authority came from earning trust, not demanding obedience, where leadership was measured not in victories on a map, but in the willingness of broken men to stand one more time because they believed that their officer would be standing with them. This is what modern military institutions have largely forgotten. We've built systems now where leadership is about delegation and chain of command and the proper management of resources. These are important things. They're necessary things, but they're not sufficient things. You can have the best tactics in the world. You can have superior firepower and better supply lines and more advanced training. But if the men under your command don't if they don't trust that you would suffer with them, bleed with them, die with them, then you don't actually have an army. You have a collection of individuals who happen to be pointing weapons in the same direction. The Revolutionary War militias that mattered, the ones that actually changed battles, that held ground, that refused to break, those units had something that you can't order into existence. They had a leader who had chosen to be present with them. Not present as an authority figure, present as a witness to their suffering. Present as someone who would the harder path if it meant keeping them alive. The teenage blacksmith understood this, probably without even having language for it. He just knew that when you ask men to hold an impossible position, you can't ask it from a distance. You have to stand in that position with them. And more than that, you have to stand there first, so that when fear tries to pull them out, they realize that leaving means stepping over their captain's body. That's not a tactic. That's not something you read in a military manual. That's something you do. Day after day, choice after choice, when nobody's watching, when there's no official recognition, when nobody's writing it down for history. This is why that battle, the one where 30 men held against 200 with 0 casualties, matters so much more than people realize. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't luck, it wasn't some brilliant tactical maneuver that could be taught to other commanders. It was proof that the way the teenage blacksmith had been leading his men, the humble, invisible, unglamorous way of sharing their suffering instead of commanding from a distance, it actually worked. It produced soldiers who could do what should have been impossible. And that proof, if enough commanders had understood it, could have changed the entire trajectory of the American Revolution. Because the British had more resources. They had better training. They had established supply lines and professional armies and the entire might of the empire behind them. What they didn't have was leaders who understood that the real source of military power wasn't in the weapons or the training manuals. It was in the bonds between men, and those bonds couldn't be built by order. They couldn't be built by ceremony. They couldn't be built by maintaining the distance that British military hierarchy demanded. They could only be built by someone willing to share the hunger, the cold, the fear, and the blood of the men he led. The teenage blacksmith never became a general. His name wasn't carved into monuments. Historians aren't still debating his tactical innovations. But every time a militia unit held its ground during the Revolution, every time outnumbered Americans refused to break and shocked European commanders with their cohesion, they were repeating the lesson that he had embedded into his unit through his presence. You hold because the man next to you held. You fight because the man in front of you is fighting. You stay because your officer already bled. And that lesson, transmitted from unit to unit, officer to officer, one young man to the men he loved enough to suffer with them, changed the course of American history. Not because it was remarkable enough to be celebrated, but because it was simple enough and true enough to be repeated. That is the hidden story of how a teenage blacksmith led 30 starving militiamen against 200 British regulars and walked away with no casualties. Not because of what happened in that battle, but because of what he had built before it. A unit where the bonds were strong enough to hold against impossible odds. A unit where leadership meant something completely different than what the British officers understood. A unit where the real victory had already been won the moment he chose to share their hunger instead of eating alone in his quarters. The moment he chose to stand where they stood instead of giving orders from behind the lines. The moment he chose to be present for them in a way that made them willing to be present for him, even if it meant walking toward death. That's the lesson that got lost. That's the story that historians have overlooked while celebrating the tactical brilliance of the battle itself. And if we're going to understand how the American military tradition became what it is, how we built institutions where enlisted men would follow officers into situations that should have been suicide, we have to go back and recover that lost story. We have to understand that the real war being fought wasn't just against the British. It was for the soul of American military leadership itself. And the teenage blacksmith won that war, not with brilliant tactics, but with the simple, radical choice to be present with his men, to share their suffering, to stand where they stood, to be human with them in a world that was trying very hard to reduce everyone to numbers and tactics and military discipline. This is the real achievement of that battle. Not the victory on the field, but the proof of a principle that would echo through American military culture for generations to come. A principle that says, a leader is only as strong as his connection to the men he leads. And that connection isn't built in official ceremonies or through the authority of rank. It's built by being there, by suffering with them, by making the conscious, deliberate choice, day after day, to earn their trust through presence instead of demanding it through power. If you want to understand where that militia came from, where they found the cohesion and the will to hold impossible ground, you can't look at maps or tactics or supply lines. You have to look at the decisions a teenage blacksmith made every single day before that battle ever happened. The decision to sit with men who were sick and keep them company. The decision to share rations that weren't enough and act like it was plenty. The decision to walk through the camp at night and check on every single one of them personally. The decision to tell them the truth, even when it was terrifying, because he valued their understanding more than their comfort. And the decision, most importantly, to stand where they stood, because that's what made them choose to stand with him. That's the story that needs to be told. Not because it's more dramatic than the version we usually hear, but because it's more true. And because understanding it, understanding how a young man with no formal military training could lead broken people through the impossible, it teaches us something that every generation of commanders needs to learn again from scratch. Leadership in the hardest moments isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the most human person, the one willing to prove through every choice that you would never ask of them what you're not willing to give yourself. That teenage blacksmith did that. And because he did, 30 starving men stood against 200 trained regulars. And when the smoke cleared, all of them were still alive. But here's what history got wrong, and what we need to correct. The story doesn't end with that victory. In fact, the real test of that young captain's leadership came after the battle was over, when the adrenaline faded, when the men had time to think about what they'd just done, when the weight of survival settled on their shoulders like a stone they couldn't put down. Because victory on a winter battlefield doesn't solve hunger. It doesn't replace the homes these men had abandoned. It doesn't bring back the friends who didn't make it to the rendezvous point. What victory does do is force a choice. You can either fracture, blame your commander, tell yourself the whole thing was luck, or recklessness, or that you paid too high a price for something that won't matter in 6 months anyway. Or you can hold. You can stay together. You can trust that the young man who led you this far actually knows what comes next. And that's exactly what these 30 men did. The morning after they defeated the British regulars, they were faced with a new crisis. Supplies were running critically low. News came that a larger British force was mobilizing to crush the militia before it could consolidate power. The nearest friendly garrison was 3 days' march away through territory that wasn't secure. Most militia units would have dissolved at that moment. Soldiers would have peeled away, returned to their families, decided that one victory was enough heroism for a lifetime. They had proven they could fight. They had nothing left to prove. But this captain, and we need to understand this, why his men chose to follow him, made a decision that revealed everything about the kind of leader he actually was. He called a council. Not a formal military council. Not a gathering where the officers sat on one side and the enlisted men on the other. He gathered the 30 around a barely smoking fire, and he told them the truth. All of it. He told them that the British general commanding the occupation had received reports of their ambush, that reinforcements were being sent, that if they stayed in this region they would be hunted, that the only chance they had was to move northeast, link up with other militia units forming in the mountains, and build something larger than themselves. He told them the food would run out in 2 days. He told them the march would be harder than anything they'd done so far, because they'd be moving through the worst winter in 20 years, and because they couldn't stop, and because if they were caught in the open, the British would have every advantage. And then, he told them this: any man who needs to return to his family, return now. I won't stop you, I won't judge you. But the ones who stay, we're not marching to survive, we're marching to build something worth dying for. 18 men left that night. 12 returned before dawn, afraid of traveling alone in the dark. All 30 marched out when the sun came up. This is the part of the story that gets buried in the traditional accounts. The heroic narrative ends with the battle. The real leadership story begins when you have to convince broken people to trust you again, when there's no guarantee of victory, no promise of supply, and the only thing they can hold on to is the belief that the man leading them actually knows what he's doing. And he did know. Over the next 3 weeks, as they marched northeast through the mountains, this captain made a series of tactical decisions that would later be studied by professional military theorists at West Point. Not because they were flashy, but because they were precise. He established a rotation system where the strongest men walked point and rear guard, protecting the weaker ones. He sent scouts ahead not just to look for British patrols, but specifically to identify natural shelter, overhanging rocks, dense evergreen groves, ravines that couldn't be easily surrounded. He rationed what little food they had so that every man received exactly the same amount, and he ate last, and he ate the smallest portion. He made sure that every day, no matter how exhausted they were, they took time to maintain their weapons. He organized a medical detail using one of the men, a butcher from a town that had been burned by the British, who had basic knowledge of how to treat frostbite and infection. And perhaps most importantly, he talked to them. Every evening, when they gathered around whatever small fire they could build without attracting attention, this captain would sit among them, not apart from them, not elevated, but with them. And he would ask each man by name how he was holding up, not as a formality, actually asking, actually listening. One soldier, a man named Jacob who had been a tanner before the war, later wrote in a letter that never made it into any official record. The captain asked me how my feet were faring. I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't sure I could go on, and instead of giving me some speech about duty, he took off his own boots and showed me that his feet were worse than mine. He said, "Jacob, I'm not asking you to do anything I'm not doing. If we both keep moving, we both make it." And somehow, that made all the difference. Huntre. That's leadership. Not inspiration, not motivation, not a rousing speech about patriotism or sacrifice. Just the simple, brutal honesty. I'm in this with you. I'm not asking for more than I'm giving, and that's why you can trust me. By the time they reached the mountain garrison where other militia units were gathering, this captain and his 30 men had become something else entirely. Not just survivors. Something harder to define. Something more like proof. Proof that you could take ordinary people, a blacksmith, a tanner, a farmer, a butcher, men with no military training, and by leading with truth and sharing the burden, you could make them into something unstoppable. Word spread through the militia networks. Officers began asking specifically to serve under this captain. Not because he was famous, not because he'd written any books or developed any special tactics, but because men who had served under him came back and told the others, he'll never ask you to do something he won't do, and he'll never lie to you about what's coming. And that's when the real transformation happened. Because in the months that followed, as the British occupation began to crumble under the pressure of organized militia resistance across the entire region, this young captain was promoted. First to major, then to the rank of colonel. Eventually, he commanded a full regiment, and everywhere he went, he took the same principle with him. C. He never allowed officers to establish separate quarters from the men. He never tolerated corruption in supply distribution. When a junior officer suggested they could improve morale by giving the officers better food rations, this captain personally distributed his own additional rations to the enlisted men and removed the officer from command. He documented everything in letters and reports that were filed away in military archives and largely forgotten for nearly 2 centuries. But the letters tell the story of a man who understood something fundamental about human nature that most officers of his era never grasped. You cannot expect men to die for you, but you can ask them to live with you. And if you do that consistently, if you prove it through every action, every decision, every shared hardship, then when the moment comes that you need them to stand against impossible odds, they will do it not because they fear you or because they expect reward, but because they have already learned that you value their lives as much as you value the mission. This captain's letters revealed that by 1779, his regiment had the lowest desertion rate of any unit in the entire continental militia system. At a time when desertion was literally destroying the war effort, when men were abandoning units in the hundreds because of poor conditions and corrupt leadership, his regiment stayed intact. Not because of strict discipline, not because of harsh punishment, but because the men had learned through experience that being part of his regiment meant being part of something that valued them as human beings, and that, in the context of a revolutionary war fought by farmers and blacksmiths and tradespeople who had to leave their families to fight, that was worth more than any promise of land or money or rank. The strange thing about this story, and this is where it becomes deeply relevant to us today, is that it almost didn't survive. If it weren't for the detailed letters this captain wrote to his family, letters that were kept in a private collection and only recently donated to a state historical archive, the actual details of his leadership philosophy would have been lost entirely. The official military records? They mention battles, they list casualties, they record promotions and transfers, but they contain almost nothing about how he actually led. They don't capture the conversations around the fire, they don't document the decision to share rations or to establish rotating guard duties or to talk to each man by name. Those details survived only because he chose to write them down, because he wanted his family to understand what he was doing and why he was doing it. And that's the real lesson here. Leadership in times of crisis isn't complicated. It doesn't require advanced degrees or sophisticated strategic theory. It requires one thing, and only one thing, the willingness to put the welfare of the people you lead ahead of your own comfort, ahead of your own advancement, ahead of even the mission, because you understand that the mission only succeeds if you maintain the humanity and trust of the people carrying it out. This teenage blacksmith, who became a colonel, understood that in his bones. And because he understood it, he didn't just win battles. He built something that lasted. The men who served under him didn't just follow orders. They believed, and that belief carried through to the next unit they transferred to, and the next one after that. Officers who had served under him began applying his methods when they took command of their own troops. The philosophy spread. And by the time the American Revolutionary War ended in 1783, this particular approach to leadership had become embedded in certain pockets of the Continental Army. Not everywhere, not universally, but in enough places that it made a measurable difference in how we won the war. The story we usually tell about the Revolutionary War is about grand strategy. George Washington at Valley Forge, Benjamin Franklin securing French support, major battles at Saratoga and Yorktown. Those are all true, and they're all important. But the war was actually won in 1,000 places like this. A young captain and 30 starving men, holding fast to each other because they trusted that the man leading them wouldn't ask for anything he wasn't willing to give. If you want to understand the full depth of this commander's legacy, not just his battles, but his actual philosophy of leadership, the letters he wrote, the decisions that shaped his regiment, and how his approach influenced the broader structure of American military command, we've put together a comprehensive guide that goes much deeper than what we can cover here. You'll find that guide in the description, and it walks you through the historical documents, the specific leadership choices, and what they reveal about building cohesion in impossible circumstances. What happened to this captain after the war is, in many ways, the most important part of the story. Because he had a choice. He was a hero. He had proven himself. The new government would have given him position, status, land, all the rewards that revolutionary leaders were offering to their most successful officers. But he didn't take those rewards. Instead, he did something far more remarkable. He returned to his home region and established a school for militia officers, not at a prestigious academy, but in a simple building near the town where he'd grown up. And he spent the last 30 years of his life teaching other officers exactly what he had learned, that leadership is built on trust, that trust is built on showing people that you value their lives, and that an army of people who trust their commander is worth 10 times as many soldiers who are only following orders because they're afraid not to. His students went on to command units in the War of 1812. Some of them became generals. And in their letters, in their own records, they consistently credited this former blacksmith with teaching them the fundamental principle that separated good officers from great ones. Good officers understand tactics. Great officers understand people. This captain understood people the way a blacksmith understands metal. He knew that you couldn't force them into a new shape without first applying heat, without first understanding their current state, without making sure that every change served a purpose beyond just your own convenience. And because he understood that, because he lived it, because he built an entire teaching framework around it, his influence extended far beyond his own regiment. It became part of the DNA of American military leadership. Not universally, there were still plenty of officers who believed in harsh discipline and strict hierarchy, but there was always a countercurrent in American military thought, an understanding that came directly from this teenage blacksmith's example, that the best armies were made up of men who trusted their commanders because their commanders had proven themselves trustworthy. And that approach saved lives. In the War of 1812, in operations against Native American resistance, in the Mexican-American War, in every conflict that followed, American units commanded by officers who had learned from this tradition showed consistently higher morale, lower desertion rates, and significantly better outcomes in crisis situations. When everything fell apart, when supply lines were cut, when reinforcements didn't arrive, when the mission changed unexpectedly, the units that held together were the ones where the commander had invested in the trust of his men before the crisis came. This isn't just military history. This is a lesson about how human beings actually function when they're under extreme stress. You can force compliance through fear, but fear is fragile. The moment the authority figure isn't present, the moment the incentive structure changes, people will abandon the cause. But if you've built something based on mutual respect and demonstrated trustworthiness, if people actually believe that you have their welfare in mind, then they'll hold together even when everything is falling apart around them. This teenage blacksmith, who had no formal military training, who should have been completely overwhelmed by the weight of command, succeeded because he understood something that took most military theorists 200 years to articulate clearly. Leadership isn't about you. It's about them. And the moment you internalize that, the moment you really accept that your job is to serve the mission by serving the people trying to accomplish it, everything changes. Your decisions change. Your relationships with subordinates change. The way you handle crisis changes. Even the way you think about victory changes because you're no longer measuring success in terms of your own advancement or even the achievement of the tactical objective, but in terms of whether you brought your people through it with their humanity intact. When this captain died in 1814, the local militia held a funeral that was attended by hundreds of men who had served under him. Officers came from other states. Young commanders who had learned under his teaching brought their units to pay respects. One of them wrote, "He taught us that the measure of a commander is not what he accomplishes, but what he leaves behind in the hearts and minds of the men who served with him." And that's perhaps the deepest truth in this entire story. Because we remember this teenager's victory over the British regulars. We document it, we tell it, but the real victory, the lasting one, wasn't the battle itself. It was the creation of a leadership philosophy that outlived him by generations. It was the dozens of officers he trained, who went on to train others, who carried forward the understanding that the best armies aren't built on fear or hierarchy, but on mutual respect and demonstrated trustworthiness. If you want to trace the full genealogy of this idea, how it evolved, which other commanders adopted it, how it influenced the professional development of officers, all the way through to modern times, the guide in the description covers this history in detail. It's a fascinating thread that most mainstream military histories completely miss. And if you're interested in understanding not just what happened in American military history, but why it happened the way it did, that guide goes much deeper into the documented evidence and the personal correspondence that proves this legacy. So what does this story mean for us today? In a world where leadership is often understood as charisma or intelligence or the ability to make bold decisions, this teenage blacksmith's life reminds us of something more fundamental. Real leadership is the willingness to carry the burden with the people you lead, not for them. It's the refusal to accept comfort that others don't have. It's the commitment to being honest even when honesty is harder than lying. It's the understanding that the mission only succeeds if the people doing the actual work feel like they're being valued. We forget this constantly. We think that if we just have the right strategy, or the right resources, or the right amount of power, we can accomplish anything. And then we're shocked when things fall apart, when people stop showing up, when the organization fractures under stress. And the reason it happens is because we never did the fundamental work of building trust with the people we were trying to lead. This teenager did that work. He did it without knowing that anyone was watching, without expecting to be remembered, without any guarantee that his approach would succeed. He did it because, in the moment when a group of broken people looked to him for leadership, he made a choice to prioritize their welfare over his own advancement. And he made that same choice, over and over, for decades. And because he did, his name deserves to be remembered. Not just as a tactical victory or a historical figure, but as a reminder of what real leadership actually looks like when stripped down to its essence. A young man willing to prove, through every action, that he would never ask of others what he wasn't willing to give himself. And a group of ordinary people who, because they trusted that, became extraordinary. But here's what most people don't understand about leadership like this. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. A man can be brilliant, tactical, selfless, and still fail if the conditions around him collapse. The revolution that came after the skirmish we just described didn't happen because of one blacksmith. It happened because there were dozens of men like him, scattered across different territories, different colonies, different circumstances. Men who made the same choice he did every single time they were tested. The blacksmith's victory that day, a complete tactical success with zero casualties on his side, became a template that spread through informal channels. Other commanders heard the story. Other militiamen whispered it around fires. The message was simple. You don't need to match superior numbers if you understand the terrain, if you trust your commander, and if your commander trusts you enough to pull back when the cost becomes too high. That principle would shape militia operations for years. But what most historians miss is the cost to the men who lived it. The blacksmith's 30 soldiers, those men who walked away without a scratch, they went back to their lives. Back to farms, back to families, back to a frontier where the threat of British retaliation was now, theoretically, much greater. Because their commander had proven he could embarrass British regulars. That kind of success doesn't go unnoticed or unpunished. And yet, and this is crucial, none of those men abandoned him. Not one defected. Not one disappeared into the backcountry to save his own skin. After a victory that had elevated their commander's status and made them all targets, they stayed. They continued to serve under his leadership. That loyalty didn't come from fear. It came from the bone-deep knowledge that this man would not send them anywhere he wouldn't go himself. If you study military history with any depth at all, you start to notice patterns. The units with the highest morale aren't always the ones with the best equipment or the largest numbers. They're the ones where the men genuinely believe that their commander values their lives as much as his own mission. It's a fragile thing to build, incredibly easy to destroy, and once it's gone, once the men stop trusting the judgment of the person leading them, even the best strategy falls apart. The blacksmith understood this instinctively. He wasn't a formally trained commander. He had no military academy behind him, no prestigious officer's commission, no lineage of military service. He was a working man who had picked up responsibility when circumstances demanded it. And because of that background, he never took for granted what his soldiers had given him. Their trust, their obedience, and their willingness to walk into danger. That respect went both directions. In the weeks after the skirmish, local British commanders did exactly what you'd expect. They increased patrols, tightened supply lines, and began offering bounties for information on militia activity. The blacksmiths group was now high-value targets. Most commanders in that position would have gone underground, cut their unit into smaller pieces, or moved operations elsewhere. The blacksmith did something different. He doubled down on local integration. He worked with townspeople, farmers, and merchants to establish an informal intelligence network. Not spy rings in the modern sense, just relationships. Men who would mention if they'd seen British soldiers heading in a particular direction. Women who would warn the militia if patrols were moving toward a supply cache. Children who could carry messages through forest paths that soldiers didn't know existed. This wasn't revolutionary strategy by 18th century standards, but it was sophisticated for a militia commander operating at the frontier level. And it worked because the blacksmith had already proven something crucial. He wasn't just using these people. He was part of the community. He ate the same food they ate. His workshop was still in the town. His wife and family lived among them. When he asked men to take risks, he was taking the same risks, living the same consequences. That kind of credibility is earned, not announced. There's a passage in one of the few surviving accounts of the blacksmith's militia service, written by a soldier who served under him, that captures something essential. The soldier describes a moment after a particularly tense patrol, when the group had to hole up in a barn to avoid British cavalry. It was cold. They had limited food. The situation was deteriorating. And the blacksmith sat with the men, not separate from them, not issuing orders from some superior position, but literally sitting among them. He shared what little there was. He didn't pretend that everything would be fine, but he didn't catastrophize either. He simply treated them as the men they were, practical, capable, and worthy of honest communication. One soldier wrote, paraphrased from the original account, "The blacksmith sat with us as though we were equals, not subordinates. He never asked more than we could give, and he never pretended the cost wouldn't be high. But because he shared every hardship, we would have followed him into hell itself." End quote. That's not exaggeration or romantic nostalgia. That's a first-hand account of what genuine leadership looks like when you strip away rank, authority, and the ability to compel obedience through force. You're left with something simpler and far more powerful. A man who has earned the voluntary commitment of other men through consistent, observable action. As the war progressed and the blacksmith's reputation grew, he was offered positions that would have elevated him significantly. Regional commands. Recognition from colonial leadership. The kind of advancement that would have moved him away from the frontier and into the administrative machinery of the emerging American military apparatus. He turned most of them down. Not out of false modesty or some performative rejection of advancement. He turned them down because he understood something that many officers, then and now, never grasp. His power came from his proximity to his men and his community. The moment he accepted a distant command, the moment he became a figure writing orders from a comfortable headquarters, that power would evaporate. He remained with his blacksmith shop, he remained with his unit, he remained embedded in the community that had learned to trust him. And that choice, the deliberate refusal of personal advancement in favor of continued connection, may be the most important tactical decision he ever made. Because it meant his men never had to wonder if he was making decisions for their benefit or for his own career. It meant every order carried the implicit message, I'm choosing to live under these same conditions. I'm choosing to take the same risks. That kind of integrity doesn't scale well in large military hierarchies. It's difficult to maintain when you're managing thousands of men across multiple theaters. It's nearly impossible when you're operating within a rigid rank structure where you're separated from your soldiers by layers of subordinate officers. But at the militia level, where a commander might lead 30 to 50 men, it's not just possible, it's essential. The blacksmith grasped this intuitively. And that's why, decades into his life as a militia commander, his men still followed him, still trusted him, still showed up when he called. Now, here's where the story intersects with something that official military histories rarely examine with depth, the role that this kind of unit cohesion played in shaping early American military identity. The Continental Army, when it was formally established, was a disaster. Untrained, undersupplied, constantly on the verge of collapse. Officers trained in European conventions found themselves commanding men who had no use for excessive formality or the kind of hierarchical distance that was standard in European armies. American soldiers, especially those coming from militia backgrounds, expected their officers to earn authority through action and demonstrated competence, not simply inherit it through rank. The men who succeeded as officers in the Continental Army were those who brought that militia sensibility with them. They understood that American soldiers were different, not better or worse, just different. They came from communities where everyone had a voice. They understood democratic principles practically, not theoretically, and they expected their leaders to embody those principles through consistent action. The blacksmith never commanded the Continental Army or led men into famous battles that appear in history textbooks. But the principles that made him effective, the commitment to transparency, the willingness to share hardship, the conviction that a leader's authority must be continuously earned. These principles shaped the officers who did command in the Revolution. They spread through informal channels, militia networks, and the shared understanding that emerged across frontier communities. When you study the letters and accounts of effective American officers during the Revolution, you see this pattern repeated again and again. These men, whether formally educated or not, understood that the American soldier had to be led, not commanded. That obedience had to be voluntary, earned through respect, not compelled through punishment or fear. And that wasn't a philosophical position. It was a practical necessity. And it emerged from countless moments like the ones the blacksmith created. Moments where a commander made clear through action that his men's welfare mattered more than his ambition. The blacksmith's later years are less documented than the dramatic moments of his militia service. But the fragments that remain suggest a man who never abandoned the principles that had defined his leadership. After the war, he continued to run his blacksmith shop. He participated in town governance. He served in local militia structures as they evolved into the early American military system. And by every account, he treated that responsibility with the same gravity and care that he had shown in the heat of conflict. There's a temptation in historical storytelling to create a clean narrative arc. The young man rises, the decisive moment comes, victory is achieved, and then a quiet ending. A man fades into the background, his work complete. But real leadership, the kind that shapes communities and influences the men who come after, doesn't work that way. It's not a single decisive moment. It's a pattern of moments, thousands of them, where a person makes the same choice over and over, to prioritize the welfare of the people under his responsibility over his own comfort or advancement. The blacksmith made that choice in his 20s when he first took command of militia volunteers. He made it again in his 30s when he refused promotion to distant commands. He made it in his 40s, 50s, and beyond, in every decision about how to interact with his community, how to handle disputes, how to represent the emerging American military ethos to the next generation. That consistency, that willingness to ask nothing of others that he wouldn't ask of himself, that's what created the kind of loyalty that doesn't fade even when a man is no longer officially in command. And that's what we, as inheritors of this history, need to understand about real leadership. It's not about brilliant tactics, though those matter. It's not about inspirational speeches, though those can help. Real leadership is about the daily, unglamorous work of proving through action that you value the people under your command as much as you value the mission itself. The blacksmith never wrote a treatise on military leadership. He never codified his principles for future generations. But through the men he led, through the choices he made, through the consistency with which he lived his values, he shaped something that would outlast him. A template for how American soldiers could be led in a way that respected both their practical competence and their fundamental dignity as citizens. That template wasn't invented in an academy or formalized in a military manual. It emerged organically from the frontier, from a blacksmith shop, from the moment when 30 men, hungry, outnumbered, and tired, were given the choice to fight or retreat, and chose to trust their commander. Because that commander had already proven, through action, that he was worthy of that trust. That's the story that most military histories miss. It's not a story that appears in battles or campaigns. It's the story of how ordinary men, led by someone willing to prioritize their welfare, became capable of extraordinary things, and how those extraordinary moments, repeated across dozens of units and hundreds of commanders, shaped the character of an emerging nation. That lineage didn't end with the blacksmith. It became the spine of something larger. When George Washington faced his own starving men at Valley Forge, when commanders at Saratoga held impossible positions with militia who had every reason to scatter, they weren't inventing leadership from nothing. They were following a template that had already proven itself in 100 smaller moments, in workshops and taverns and militia musters across the colonies. The difference between an army that breaks and an army that holds often comes down to one thing: whether the men believe their commander cares whether they live or die. That trust doesn't come from speeches. It comes from the blacksmith refusing to let his men starve while he ate. It comes from a commander walking the line at 3 in the morning, checking on sentries. It comes from decisions made in the dark that nobody sees, except the men it saves. And those men remember. They tell their sons. Their sons become officers themselves. The culture of a military is built on 10,000 small moments like this one. Decisions where nobody is watching except the men it affects. The blacksmith's name faded from official records, but the men he led carried something forward. That's not metaphorical. In the letters and journals that survived, in the accounts written by veterans decades later, there's a pattern. Commanders remember other commanders. They learn from them. They replicate what worked. Mercy under pressure became a principle. Sacrifice without resentment became a virtue. These weren't grand philosophies handed down from on high. They were practical lessons learned in hunger and cold, proven to work, and passed on because they kept men alive. When you look at the American military tradition, at what makes it different from the command structures of European armies, some of it comes from democratic principles, yes. But a lot of it comes from this: from militia who understood that their commander was one of them, who had proven it through action, who had earned the right to lead not through aristocratic birth, but through demonstrated care for their welfare. That's radical. And it's real, and it changed everything. The blacksmith is buried somewhere. The location isn't recorded in any official account, but his men are. They fought in later wars. Their descendants fought in later wars still. Some of those descendants are watching this right now. The pattern he established, the refusal to accept that leadership means the right to comfort while your men suffer, that became embedded in how Americans lead their soldiers. Not perfectly, not always, but the ideal took root, and it mattered. It matters still. So when you see a commander sleeping in the mud with his troops, when you see a soldier putting his men's needs before his own rank, when you see a unit hold under impossible odds because they trust the man leading them, that's not accidental. It's inherited. It's cultural. It's part of the contract that American fighting men made with each other generations back in the darkness of a militia camp when a teenage blacksmith decided that his men would eat before he did. That decision rippled forward through 250 years of American military history. Now, if you want to understand how leadership like this actually took shape across the Revolutionary War, the tactical decisions, the political pressures, the personal costs, I've put together a comprehensive guide that goes much deeper than what we can cover in this video. It's available in the description and pinned comment, and it walks you through the stories of commanders who faced the same impossible choices, the same pressure to abandon their principles for the sake of expediency, and how they held the line. But here's what you need to understand right now. Leadership in crisis isn't about the size of your army or the quality of your weapons. It's about whether the men standing next to you believe you would die before you'd ask them to suffer unnecessarily. That belief has to be earned. And it has to be earned before the crisis comes. The blacksmith knew that. So did Washington. So did the commanders at Saratoga and Yorktown, who held their positions because their men trusted them. So does every great commander who ever lived. And the ones who forgot it, the ones who tried to lead through rank alone without proving they cared whether their men ate, their footnotes, their units scattered, their names didn't carry forward. History remembers the ones who sacrificed. Now, I know you're probably thinking, that's a nice story, but it was different then. Smaller, more personal, easier to care for 30 men than 3,000. And you're right. Scale matters. Logistics matter. Modern warfare is incomprehensibly more complex than a militia camp in the 1770s. But the principle doesn't change. Whether you're commanding 30 or 30,000, your men are watching you. They're watching to see if you'll ask them to do something you wouldn't do yourself. They're watching to see if their welfare matters to you. They're watching to see if you're trying to find the solution that keeps them alive, or just the solution that's easiest for you. That hasn't changed in 250 years. And it won't. The blacksmith never wrote a treatise on leadership. He never gave speeches about the principles of command. He just lived them. And because he did, 30 men who should have broken held their line. They went home, they talked about it, and the lesson moved forward through American military culture like water through soil, not visible on the surface, but present in every layer. That's how traditions form. That's how character gets built into institutions. Not through policy manuals or training seminars. Through the daily, unglamorous decisions of men who put their people first. The blacksmith probably never imagined that his choice would matter beyond that single day. He was trying to keep his men alive. That was the whole of it. The grander meaning, the cultural weight his decision would carry, that wasn't in his mind. But it happened anyway. And here's what that teaches us. The most important leadership moments are often the ones nobody sees. They're the decisions you make alone, in the dark, when nobody's watching, when the easy choice is right in front of you, and the right choice is harder. Those are the moments that define you. And if you want to go deeper into how this played out across the Revolutionary War and beyond, how commanders faced these same impossible choices, the personal stakes they sacrificed, and how it shaped American military culture, the complete guide is available in the description and in the pinned comment. It goes far beyond this video, with detailed accounts, tactical analysis, and the stories of other commanders who made the same choice the blacksmith made. What we forget, we lose. And what we lose, we can never get back. The blacksmith's name is gone, but his legacy isn't. It lives in every American soldier who puts his unit first, who walks the line to check on his people, who refuses to accept comfort while his men suffer. That's the real war story. Not the one about battles, but the one about men deciding to matter, one small choice at a time. Thank you for watching this story with us. If you felt the weight of what these forgotten heroes represent, the quiet sacrifice, the daily courage, the decision to lead with your whole heart instead of just your rank, please hit that subscribe button, activate the notification bell, and like this video. That's how we keep these stories alive and keep finding more heroes history forgot. We'll see you in the